I had left off on part 5, talking about whether Truman Capote's written account in Cold Blood actually added up, and went through the details of both Richard Hickok and Perry Smith's 1959 parole plans that were submitted to the Kansas State Penitentiary officials before both of them were discharged from the institution later on that year. And what happened when they were, and what their plans were to go back home, and both of them were very similar, and both of them said that they wanted to go back to where they had grown up and be around their parents. Perry Smith's mother was not alive, but he was going to go back and live with his dad and find work up there. And Hickok had told the officials there at the institution he was going to do about the same thing. He wanted to go home out there to Edgerton, Kansas, and farm the farm, because he had become aware that his father had cancer and wasn't able to support himself or his mother anymore, and he was going to take those duties on, and he would make enough to do that and take care of his children. And that was basically the plan by both of them up until the entrance of a person named Floyd Wells. And I had talked to you about that, this encounter inside the institution after Perry Smith had been paroled out, and Wells came in and became the cellmate of Dick Hickok, and how the story about the safe and the Clutters and their farm and all of the money that was in there, and how he had seen that safe installed in the office of Herb Clutter out there at the farmhouse with his own eyes, and that he knew for a fact that there was at least $10,000 cash inside the safe at all times, and sometimes more than that. So I want to continue on now with the account recorded in Cold Blood, and then compare that to what was relayed to my father much earlier by Richard Hickok regarding basically the same subjects. In Cold Blood, quote page 23, "Now suddenly a whole party of them appeared, and Teddy the dog rushed forward, roaring out a challenge. But it was odd about Teddy. Though he was a good sentry, alert, ever ready to raise Cain, his valor had one flaw. Let him glimpse a gun, as he did now, for the intruders were armed, and his head dropped, his tail turned in. No one understood why, for no one knew his history, other than he was a vagabond that Kenyon had adopted years ago." According to Hickok's first 2 letters to nations, written there back in May and June of 1961, Hickok did not have a weapon when he approached the Clutter home alone and found the door unlocked the night of the murders. Smith and Hickok then returned together armed with a hunting knife and a 12-gauge shotgun, both of which belonged to Dick Hickok, to make their way into the Clutter family home undetected. The point of bringing this up is I used to live on a farm and a ranch, and most of them always have dogs on the property. It's very common. And my point about this issue is a dog living on a family farm that does not either bark at complete strangers on the property or noises that they make in the middle of the night seems to be very difficult scenario to actually believe. Especially odd since both Hickok and Smith were reported stating to both Nations and Capote that they made multiple trips on foot from their parked vehicle back and forth to the Clutter house during the night of the murders, and neither killer ever mentioned encountering or even hearing the family's dog. That's just a very, very peculiar scenario. Whether the dog was a coward or not really doesn't have too much to do with the fact that neither one of these men that committed these murders even saw him that night, noticed him, or heard him bark. Most dogs that are not going to be aggressive at least bark out and make it known that they're there. But according to Hickok and Smith, they never even saw the dog that night. In Cold Blood, reference page 266, Capote writes in Smith's account given to KBI agents Dewey and Dunce on the ride back from Las Vegas, Nevada to Garden City, Kansas. Full moon about midnight. Caretaker's light came on and off 2 times, and Smith told Hickok to count him out. That was inside the car while they were sitting on the road out there in front of the Clutter house before either one of them got out of the car to go up there to the house to find out if they can gain entry to the house. The reason I brought that up is the confession is consistent with Hickok's June 4th, 1961 letter relayed to Nations about Smith backing out of the planned armed robbery of a large grocery store in Wilmington, California, once those 2 guys had returned from Mexico. They ended up there by Los Angeles, and there was a brand new grocery store, and it was there in Wilmington, type of a suburb, I suppose, if you will, of LA, and they were eyeballing that because they didn't have any money. They did have weapons. They both had pistols, and they felt like that they could go in there and rob that grocery store and take the money that they got from that and then flee. But when it came time, according to Hickok, what he told my dad was that when it became time for them to pull that job, Smith backed out. And it's very similar to him wanting to back out the night of the murders, sitting there in front of the house when he told Hickok that they should leave, that they shouldn't go through with it, that they should leave. Reference: the April 6, 1965 Kansas clemency hearing handwritten notes at KSP. Perry Smith stated that Hickok and Smith first took Nancy out of the upstairs bathroom containing all 4 victims and tied her up in her bed. Did not tape her mouth, is what Smith said to this committee. This is about 1 week, 8 days before the 2 of them hung. It was the last official act that was going to be taken on their part as far as legal measures to see if they could avoid being hung. Smith took Kenyon to the basement, turned on the basement light, and tied him to the overhead pipe. So you have Kenyon being taken downstairs by Smith at night point, and Smith has a flashlight, but he turns on the basement light, which would have illuminated the entire basement from the outside the house, and tied him to the overhead pipe. Smith told the committee that the bathroom could be locked from both inside and outside the door. That was on the 2nd floor, where the mother and the father and were still inside the bathroom at that time. Smith said that a chair was placed in the bathroom for Mrs. Clutter to sit on. Smith stated he took Kenyon's transistor radio and $3 silver from Nancy's bedroom. Smith said that Hickok had taken money out of Mr. Clutter's wallet in his downstairs bedroom, and some money found in Mrs. Clutter's purse in her upstairs bedroom. Took Mrs. Clutter to her bedroom and tied her hands to the bed headboard and her feet to the foot of the bed. Mrs. Clutter said that the ropes were too tight, so loosened rope. Smith said it was a nice idea. Took Mr. Clutter to the basement, untied Kenyon from the overhead pipe, and took him to the couch and retied him in the recreation room, and then Mr. Clutter tied in the furnace room. Hickok and Smith then searched the basement for the safe. They hadn't been able to find it upstairs, where Wells had told him that that's where it was at, and had given him diagrams and told him over and over and over, hey, you can find it right there, it'll be easy to see. But it wasn't there, and they thought, well, maybe it's downstairs then, maybe they moved it, or whatever the reason. They still thought that there was a safe in the house. Smith returned to the furnace room and Mr. Clutter. This is after he's laying down on the cardboard mattress box. The boy's been moved to the other room, on the couch in there, tied up. Smith said Mr. Clutter's mouth was taped when he asked him again where the safe was. Smith stated he was so disappointed in Hickok and was becoming angrier and angrier, things going through his head. He had the knife, went over to Mr. Clutter, leaned over, and cut Mr. Clutter's throat. In cold blood, quote page 271, November 15, 1959, in cold blood account, Capote writes that Smith said, watching myself in some nutty movie, describing how he felt that night inside the Clutter house That's what he said it was like. Reference. Hickok told Nations in his May 14, 1961 letter, "It was at this time, but things started appearing different to me. This is inside the house. They've already got the people gathered around, and things aren't working out the way Dick Hickok thought they would." And he continues, "Just what I mean by different, I am finding it difficult to put into words. In fact, I am finding it almost impossible to express in any manner. Even to myself, it seems that everything was happening and going to happen regardless if I put any effort to assist or stop them. It appeared to me that I was either viewing a movie or enacting one. I suppose I could say that I was reading a script and doing what it said to do, but that doesn't explain it either. Maybe I could put it like this. A sort of incident was taking place, and all I had to do was sit back and wait, and I would be a part of it." In Cold Blood, page 272, quote, is on November 15, 1959, Capote writes that Smith said, "And yet, how can I explain this? It was like I wasn't a part of it, more as though I was reading a story, and I had to know what was going to happen, the end. So I went back upstairs." Some of these comparisons are rather remarkable. In Cold Blood, reference page 292, Capote writes that neither Perry Smith's father nor sister wrote him or came to see him. Tex John Smith was presumed to be prospecting for gold somewhere in Alaska, though lawmen, despite great effort, had been unable to find him. There's a conclusion here that I wrote. The original 1967 In Cold Blood movie shows Alvin Dewey and another KBI agent interviewing Tex Smith in his makeshift Lone Wolf pickup truck. This was a complete fabrication made for the film and is not based on any factual documentation whatsoever. Smith's sister, Barbara, aka Bobo, had told investigator KBI agent Harold Nye, now this wasn't actually Perry Smith's sister's real name, but I have no intention of revealing that. It's not necessary. KBI agent Harold Nye that she was afraid of her brother and requested that the authorities not let Smith know of her present address. When informed of this, Smith smiled slightly and said, "I wish she'd been in that house that night. What a sweet scene." I think that's a very accurate statement reflecting the true nature of Perry Edward Smith. In Cold Blood, quote page 166, he loathed Barbara, again talking about his surviving sister. And just the other day he had told Dick, "The only regret I have, I wish the hell my sister had been inside that house." Dick had laughed and confessed to a similar yearning. "I keep thinking what fun if my second wife had been there, her and all her goddamn family." You know, as time goes by, people like to revise history, and they like to say things about things and people that put them in a different light. And I think it'd be really important to keep that to 1961 and 1959 and 1960 about what these two men actually said themselves and not what other people said about them. It has a much more accurate definement of what they were really like and who they really were as human beings. Reference: Hickok's statements made to nations in his May 26, 1961 B letter concerning how he wished Finney County Judge Tate and the jurors at his Garden City, Kansas trial would have been inside the Clutter House the night of the murders. Every other time I was taken to the courtroom, this is Hickok quoting, the handcuffs were taken off. This time they stayed on, and I was cuffed to the undersheriff. When the verdict was given and the jury said the punishment was to be death, I wasn't surprised. I leaned over to the undersheriff, and I couldn't help laughing when I told him it was what I expected. I thought to myself that these pompous old ginks was the lousiest looking specimen of manhood that I had ever seen. Old cronies that acted like they were God or somebody. I wished every one of them had been at the Clutter House that night, and that included the judge. I would have found out how much God they had in them. If they were there and had any God in them, I would let it run out on the floor. I then wished I could do it while they were sitting in the courtroom. Now there was something that would have really stirred them up. When they filed out of the courtroom, not one of them would look at me. I looked at each one in the face and I kept thinking, look at me, look at me, look at me, but none of them would. The prosecution called Wells to the stand, and as he walked towards the witness stand, I looked at my dad and nodded my head. Up until this time he entered the courtroom, I had my doubts that he would testify. I didn't believe that he would take the stand and tell the court and jury what he had told me. If he did, he would be in the same fix I was. I was curious to see what kind of story he was going to put down and still keep his shirt tail clean. He was supposed to get a cut of the dough we were supposed to have found in the safe at the Clutter home. I soon found out how he was going to do it. When he told and spent $10,000 to $15,000 in one day, and that he never told me that Clutter had a safe, I wanted to get my hands on him. I thought to myself, that lying, rotten, snitching rat. And when he said that I had told him in the penitentiary that after I robbed the Clutters, I was going to tie them up and kill them, it was all I could do to keep in my chair. I honestly think that if my parents hadn't been in the courtroom, I would have tried to get him. Everything he was testifying to was lies. He was perjuring himself, and the law knew it. But they were willing to overlook his part in it if he would just help convict my partner and I. And I was made aware of the fair trial I was getting. I knew what would happen to him if they sent him back to the penitentiary. I also thought at that time that he would get a parole out of it. In fact, I would have bet the cops made the deal with him to get him to testify. I knew he wasn't going to get anything. There sat the man that was responsible for the Clutters getting killed as I was, and he isn't going to get a thing. There sat the man that told me Clutter had a safe. He drew me diagrams and demanded a share of the money. And now he's getting off scot-free just because he will testify. Wells doesn't know how close he came to getting split in his mouth and when he walked in front of me on his way out of the courtroom. More to follow. End of quote. In Cold Blood, quote, page 250, Nye took over. 1 minute, Dick. Nye is a short-tempered man who has difficulty moderating his aggressive vigor. His talent for language, both sharp and outspoken. I'd like to hear a little bit more about the trip to Fort Scott, he said, soft pedaling. When you found Smith's sister no longer there, what did you do then? Walked around, had a beer, drove back. You mean you went home? No, to Kansas City. We stopped at the Zesto drive-in and ate hamburgers. This conversation would have taken place out there in the Las Vegas jail when Dick Hickok, that is, being interviewed by the KBI agents out there concerning questioning they had for him involving his participation the night of November 15th, 1959, out there in Holcomb, Kansas. And this is part of Dick Hickok's attempt to say that they weren't out there, that they'd gone down here to Fort Scott, Kansas, looking for Perry Smith's sister, who's supposed to have lived down there so Smith could collect some money that she owed him. It was all made up, though. Reference, Hickok's undated letter number 4 to Nations, quote, after I explained this to Smith, he agreed to go to the police headquarters and register. I went in with him while he registered, and when that was taken care of, we decided to go out to Zesto's for a sandwich and a Coke. Dick Hickok told my father in this letter number 4 that when Perry Smith arrived up there to Kansas City, and he was going to be staying up in there, that it would be best, because he was a felon, a paroled felon, that he go down there and register with the police department. And Hickok said that they actually did that. Now, whether that actually happened or not, I don't know. He said it did. Perry Smith had a habit of using an alias, Bob Turner, and he may very well have put that in the paperwork when he went down there to register, if that really did happen. In Cold Blood, quote, page 196, the question aroused Mrs. Hickok. That gun cost over $100. This is the shotgun that was used to murder the Clutter family with. This is what Mrs. Hickok is talking to the KBI about. When when she was questioned about the gun and where it came from and who it belonged to. Dick bought it on credit, and now the store won't have it back, even though it's not hardly a month old and only been used the one time, the start of November, when him and David went to Grinnell on a pheasant shoot. That's pretty interesting to me as far as this statement made by Dick Hickok's mother to the KBI about how this gun was only a month old and it was bought at the very beginning of November of 1959, just a couple of weeks before the Cutters were murdered, and that both Dick Hickok and his brother went out to Grinnell, Kansas, which is way out in western Kansas, hundreds of miles away from Edgerton, Kansas, to go on a pheasant hunt. Reference: Hickok's May 26, 1961 B letter to Nations describing their stopping at a service station near Great Bend, Kansas around 4 a.m. on November the 15th, 1959, where Smith washed himself off and changed his shirt. This is approximately 2 hours or so after these men had murdered all 4 victims. Hickok told the service station attendant there in Great Bend, Kansas, on Highway number 40 the day before. I'm sorry, let me back that up. Hickok told the service station attendant and a customer that they had been hunting up by Grinnell, Kansas on Highway number 40 the day before. They wanted to know if we had any luck, and I told them we had only seen 3 cocks all day and never got a shot at them. I figured a little humor might be good, might go good, so I told them the only thing we had killed was 2 pints. Both of the men laughed, but I didn't. I thought, I wonder what these guys would think or say if they knew what we had really killed. It was bigger game than pheasants. I find this particularly interesting or significant that approximately 2 weeks before November 15th, right at the very beginning of pheasant season up there in Kansas, that Richard Hickok's mother told the KBI agents that both of her sons had gone all the way out to western Kansas through Grinnell, Kansas to go pheasant hunting, and then Dick Hickok told my father in this May 26, 1961 letter about the same thing. Didn't have any mention of his brother. I have no interest at all with any member of the Hickok family. This is strictly about Dick Hickok. But I find that really interesting that these people were way out there in western Kansas 2 weeks before Smith and Hickok found themselves in Holcomb, Kansas, way out in western Kansas as well, even though Holcomb isn't anywhere close to being up by Grinnell. It's still way out west. In cold blood, quote, page 215, Dick said, "The comedian, you kill me." He struck a match intending to smoke a cigarette, but something seen by the light of the flaring match brought him to his feet and carried him across the barn to a cow stall. A car was parked inside the stall, a black and white two-door 1956 Chevrolet. The key was in the ignition. Now, this is dealing with after the two men returned from Mexico after the murders, and they were up in Iowa. They had caught a ride with a man that worked over in Nebraska at a meat packing company, and he had taken them all the way to Omaha, and here you had them up there crossing over into Iowa, over there by Cedar Rapids. And this is where Capote says they found this car, and it was in the middle of this terrible, terrible weather, bitter cold in the wintertime, and they found a car inside this barn, and the two of them were there together. Now, this is what Dick Hickok told Mac Nations about this car. Reference Hickok's June 27, 1961 J letter to Nations describing how he spotted the 1956 Chevy parked inside of a farmhouse garage in Grant, Iowa, stole the car by himself, not with Perry Smith there, and then drove down to a place he called Tin Town Junction, Iowa, to pick up a waiting Perry Smith inside of a truck stop cafe. "Well, now we ride in style," Smith told Hickok, while the two got inside the car, and the two men then headed south on Highway 71 to Kansas City, Kansas. When we arrived in Kansas City, the first thing we done was to pick up the plates. We went to a local Buick agency where I used to work. A vacant lot behind the service department is used for parking wrecked automobiles until such a time that they are taken to the body shop for repair. After securing the plates, we drove to a residential area, and it was here we made the switch. The Iowa plates were thrown into Big 11, a lake located in the center of Kansas City, Kansas. This is just a really big difference in the whole account of how that car was found and stolen, and who did it. And Hickok said that the reason that they split up there by when they got into the corner there of Iowa and Nebraska and went across the state line was that truck drivers didn't pick up, most of them wouldn't pick up two people hitchhiking. They might pick up one, but they wouldn't pick up two generally, so they split up, and Smith went first, and he was waiting down there at this truck stop for Hickok to come along later and bring some kind of a vehicle down there and meet him, and that they would rendezvous in this truck cafe. Reference Hickok's June 5th, 1961 D letter to Nations concerning the pair's arrest in Las Vegas, Nevada. Smith and I had just pulled into a parking lot in Vegas with the intentions of stealing a generator off of a 1957 Chevrolet that was parked there. We were driving the stolen car I had picked up in Grant, Iowa, and the generator had gone bad on it. I told Smith there was no need in buying one because I could swipe one in 10 minutes. The parking lot didn't have very many lights in it, and we were waiting for it to get dark enough so we wouldn't be seen. We had been sitting there for about 15 minutes, and Smith was behind the wheel when I heard footsteps in the gravel at the side and a little to the rear of the car. When I turned to look, I saw a big policeman and bigger .38 special, and I was looking in the traffic. I thought Judas Priest. When I saw his buddy and he had his gun out, I knew what it was. And believe it or not, I felt relieved for the first time in 2 months. I thought, well, it's over. I think I'm going to stop there on part 6 of the video, and I'll make one more in this series to bring this subject to a close, probably later on this week or in the next 10 days, something like that. And that'll be the end of the video series. I would like to say something before I do stop today, and it would be this. Hopefully by now, the people that have taken the time to view these videos, they may have had their own reasons for doing so, curiosity or interest, or it's not important to me exactly why you view them. I'm glad that you are. But I hope that it becomes evident that the reason that I've made this series of videos is because I value the contribution that my father made to this entire matter enough to sit down and put all this on tape so that there'll be a record of it, so that people will know that it actually happened, and that they'll know that my father was the one that was responsible for gathering the information that I'm presenting in these videos. And it's very, very curious to me, not in a funny ha-ha way, but in a very odd way, that so much of the same story that I am relaying in these videos appear years later in this book called In Cold Blood, and that this author, Truman Capote, told everybody, and their publishing company stood behind him, the New Yorker magazine stood behind him, as to say that all of what appeared in Cold Blood was based solely on the information and investigation done by Truman Capote himself. I just want a record to reflect that this is something that I don't have any belief in at all. There's something terribly wrong, and has been something terribly wrong with this story since it came out, and I am hopeful because of this video series that people can recognize that.